What is going on, everybody? Welcome back here to the channel. I'm Sean Davis, and welcome in to the reveal of my number 24th ranked team in my NBA Preseason Power Rankings heading into the 2024 season with a in-depth look at the Detroit Pistons, a team that has burned me in the past. I never got to talk about the Pistons in previous iterations of this series. I've done them in the past on like the NBA Front Office show or whatever, but I think the furthest I got was maybe 27 in my series, which would have been the first year, I think, because I had the Thunder there. That goes to show you like how far the Thunder have come. But the Pistons, how in the hell are they 24th in this series after having one of the worst seasons of franchise histories, including one of the longest and worst losing streaks in pro sports? So we're going to dive into this Pistons team. I am really excited to talk about this Pistons team. And at the end of this episode, don't go anywhere. I have a great interview with my guy, Bryce Simon, or Motor City Hoops, also Pistons Pulse. He's a great guy, does a bunch of great stuff. One of my favorite people in general in the content space. Bryce is the man, and I'm, honored to be able to have my guy Bryce on towards the end of this episode. But there's a lot to talk about with this Pistons team. And this Pistons team has just undergone some wild changes this summer, excuse me. And this is a very important year for a lot of people here. So let's start this off how we always start this off. Firstly, let's get a recap of our tiers and things like that. Got a bunch of great content as well coming up this week, so do not miss that. But the Pistons are, once again, in this big cluster of teams in the Eastern Conference. Primarily, we do have another Western Conference team here approaching soon. But the Pistons, 24th here, they come in with a 79.34 grade for me. Barely above the Raptors and barely below the next team, who's going to be coming at a 79.40. So the Pistons right here in the thick of things, I think, in the Eastern Conference play-in race. And, there is, I think, a realistic world here, a scenario. And again, maybe I'm just abnormally high on the Pistons. But we'll talk about that here in a sec. But there's a world where I think this Pistons team can kind of surprise some people and, ultimately make the play-in. And, once you make it to the play-in game, it's kind of house money at that point. You can make it to the playoffs. But there's a lot of steps that need to go right. But first, let's start by recapping this team's offseason, looking at their key and notable additions and departures. And we're going to start this off with the departures I guess it's both. But the biggest one that I think we have to talk about here is the dramatic change that they made organizationally. They fire Monty Williams after giving him one of the largest head coaching contracts in NBA history. And Bryce talks about it with me in the interview at the end of the show, that really it just never felt like it was going to be a fit to a certain extent, right? And what I mean by that is Monty, I don't think ever really truly wanted the job because, he was obviously dealing with a bunch of personal stuff, and I absolutely give him all benefit of the doubt there. Trying to coach in those circumstances, I can only imagine how hard that would be for him, especially when your job is dealing with people at the end of the day. So having to try to ignore that to a certain extent, I can only imagine how tough that was on him. But then they also fired Troy Reaver. They let him go, the general manager, and they bring in, and I hope I don't botch the name. It's Trajan Langdon. I hope I pronounced that right. Former general manager of the New Orleans Pelicans. You bring him in. He's now the president of basketball operations here in Detroit. And I'm actually kind of optimistic about some of the stuff they've done this summer. Firing Troy Reaver, letting go of Monty, and Monty now just gets to sit on a big stack of cash while he's figuring out those family issues. And again, prayers to him and his entire family. But this summer, they really addressed, or at least attempted to address, a major need, in my opinion. They kind of started at the deadline by adding Simone Fontecchio. We'll talk about him later on. But they go out, and in terms of notable free agency acquisitions, they bring in a Tim Hardaway Jr. They bring in a Tobias Harris. Tim Hardaway Jr. trade is, for Quinn Grimes. They bring in a Tobias Harris. They bring in a Malik Beasley. Both of those guys in free agency, they gave Tobias Harris a pretty notable contract, noteworthy contract, if you will. 2 years, $52 million. And we'll talk about the contract in a sec. I recorded my interview with Bryce before the recording of this of the full episode, so I'm curious to see kind of how my opinions stick out and now after doing a little bit more research before the recording and my thoughts with Bryce. But they really, I think, tried their hardest to address the need of just freaking giving Cade Cunningham some modern floor spacing, because that's the thing. I don't want to spoil too much of my takes on these individual players, but Cade Cunningham has actively been in one of the worst situations amongst any best player in the NBA, and it's not particularly close in my opinion. So giving him actual floor spacing is really, really important. They do that, like I said, by getting Tim Hardaway Jr., by getting Tobias Harris, by getting Malik Beasley. And one thing I know for sure, I think I kind of align myself with my interview with Bryce, is the JB Bickerstaff hire, which in reality, it's, let me back up. In like a vacuum, it's a pretty meh hire, right? Like JB Bickerstaff, I just think in general is kind of he's a meh, he's fine. He's a fine coach. But I think for Detroit, where it's let's rework and reestablish the culture here in Detroit. Let's freaking play some damn defense. Like, and JB Bickerstaff is legitimately one of the 10-ish, maybe 10 to 12 best defensive coaches in the NBA currently. So you get that level of upside and you know, like confidence, I guess is the right word I'm looking for, defensively from your head coach. To man, am I excited to watch Asar Thompson play defense with JB Bickerstaff as coach this season. Can Jalen Duren, finally turn it around defensively? So if this was a championship team, and like I said, we talked about this with Blake. Sorry, not with Blake, with Bryce. If this was a championship contending team, like let's say, I don't know, the Pacers for whatever reason fired Rick Carlisle, and maybe not the best example because they're not a true title contender, but you get my point. Better example, the Suns. Let's say the Suns, who did fire Frank Vogel, they go from Frank Vogel to JB Bickerstaff. I would have really dogged that hire. But in a place like Detroit, where we are not contending, we are not even really in the playoff picture. We're trying to reestablish our brand and our franchise right now. As a transitional coach, I like this hire, and I'm excited about. I'm genuinely excited about the path forward here for the Detroit Pistons. They don't lose a ton this summer either. Actually, they lose Evan Fournier in free agency. They lose James Wiseman. They just completely let those guys walk. And honestly, I think they upgraded at all those spots. I mean, Quentin Grimes, yeah, they lose him in the Tim Hardaway Jr. trade. But in reality, if we're talking about players in, players out, they lose Evan Fournier. They lose James Wiseman. They lose Quentin Grimes. Okay. In terms of, Troy Brown Jr. too. He's not listed here. But in terms of key additions, they, get Tim Hardaway Jr. in the Quentin Grimes deal. They get Tobias Harris. They get Malik Beasley. They sign Paul Reed, who's he is an upgrade over James Wiseman, in my opinion. And then you draft Ron Holland, you draft Bobby Klintman. I think this Pistons team is well more improved over that 14 win team last season. Now, again, the bar set real low, but I'm really excited about this team. And with that being said, let's dive into the roster breakdown and really discuss why I am so high on the Detroit Pistons, so high to the point that they're the 24th in this power ranking series. Before we get to the roster breakdown, I want to tell you guys about SeatGeek because, guys, you already know football season is back. I am a massive football fan. Let's go Chargers. And with football season being back, you're going to want to use the number one ticket provider, and that is SeatGeek. You guys can get the best deals on 100% authentic tickets at SeatGeek. Use promo code Sports Headlines right now. Sports Headlines, one word, and get $20 off your first purchase of over $50 or more. Again, guys, SeatGeek is awesome. They've been very, very kind to me in our channel here. And I want to share this with you guys so you guys get the best tickets out there for reasonable prices, for being completely honest. So once again, use SeatGeek promo code Sports Headline to get $20 off your first purchase of over $50 or more. And thank you to SeatGeek for sponsoring this episode. Now let's get back to our roster breakdown, or begin our roster breakdown. And first, I do want to mention, once again, JB Bickerstaff and kind of where I have him ranked, or where I have this bench ranked, because there's a little bit more yellows. There's no greens, so I'll put up the tiers. I mean to do that here. I'll make sure I get that added in the next episode. But The bench is fine. It's in a big cluster for me of teams between 13th and 21st. It's a fine bench in the league. And JB Bickerstaff is in my tier 5 of NBA coaches. Like I said, I think he's around the 20th best. He's actually tied for 20th for me amongst NBA coaches in the league. Again, he's fine. I don't think he's a super modern coach, which does worry me just a little bit in terms of some of his offensive philosophies. They ran a lot of too big looks in Cleveland. You can potentially blame that to personnel, and I might listen to you. But the Cavs are a really, really slow pace team. They never ranked higher than, I want to say, 22nd in pace during his time in Cleveland. So, there's some knocks, on JB Bickerstaff, but he's fine at the end of the day. Like I said, fine floor. You get with JB, just not in a ridiculously high ceiling. But I don't think the Pistons are really looking for that high ceiling hire right now. They're looking for an adult in the room and a guy that can kind of stabilize things here in Detroit. But getting back to Cade, or starting with Cade, excuse me, who is the number one reason why I have the Pistons ranked so highly at 24th. Every poll I posted on like my Twitter or on here on YouTube, asking what team you guys should think next, starting at, I think I started this off in maybe 28. The Pistons won every single poll. Like, God, guys, you guys just hate the Pistons. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, Cade Cunningham has gone so severely under the radar the past couple of seasons. It actually doesn't even make sense due to the Pistons just being a god-awful basketball team, or just not even basketball team, organization, because the Pistons, truthfully, have just been the laughingstock of the NBA since Cade's got drafted, essentially. But in reality, Cade is one of the best players in the league in terms of being able to consistently generate paint touches. And he ranks 6th in the league in terms of drives per 75 possessions per B-ball index. Only 5 players rank above him in terms of drives per 75 possessions. Those players are TJ McConnell, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Brunson, Zion Williamson, and LaMelo Ball. And the list stops there. He is truly elite in terms of his on-ball ability, on-ball creation ability to get downhill, get to the rim, and it gets to the paint more importantly, which can really generate his playmaking or help generate his playmaking ability, where he's a really underrated playmaker. Cade's awesome, truly. And on top of being, an elite company in terms of ability to get downhill, get to the rim, that's also while legitimately having the worst rim shot quality of any on-ball creator in the NBA, and it's not close. He's dead last. The only one that's close, I think, is actually Jeremy Grant from Portland. We actually did talk about that with the Portland Trailblazers episode. So, again, at times, the rim field goal percentage might be a little bit low, but it's truthfully because his quality of shot at the rim is terrible. And I feel like a lot of times, people hear shot quality and think, oh, he's just chucking up shots. No, at least 60% of the time, it's the attention he's getting / the spacing sucks, or some weird combination of the two. And that's truly what the problem is. And that's kind of what it is with Cade, where I don't think he's shot chucking, definitely not around the rim, but in general. But the floor space, he's been just so egregiously awful that his shot quality has been the worst in the entire league. And I'm begging JB Bickerstaff to find a way to somewhat modernize this offense. And, again, kudos to Pistons management. They've kind of identified some of the issues, and they at least are trying to address them this offseason with acquisitions of Malik Beasley, Tobias Harris, the deadline acquisition of Simone Fontecchio. And when diving into Cade's film, that's actually been one of the best parts of this series, because I have an idea on, let's call it 90%. I don't want to give myself too much praise. 90% of the players around the league, I'd say, right? Especially the guys who are heavily covering here. But being able to specifically hone in on a player or so for each player, for each team, and really be like, damn, this guy is so good at this, or really be able to just dive in on that guy is really, really fun. And Cade's been such a big benefit of that, in my opinion. For me, just watching Cade, it is one of my more fun watches I've gotten this entire series. And it's because I think they're in the entire league, there might be only 3 players, and those guys are SGA, Jalen Brunson, and like Luka, that play with better pace out of ball screens than Cade Cunningham. And I think the list stops there. SGA is Jalen Brunson. I might maybe put Cade Cunningham above Brunson just in that particular category. in just terms of their pace. SGA and Luka are probably in a tier of their own, but Cade operates with a very similar herky-jerky kind of stop-start kind of pace, very similarly to SGA, where he's able to just put his defender in jail and decelerate our speed back up. And it's just so hard to have to guard that. He's one of the highest pick and roll ball handler usage players in the entire league. And Cade's awesome. Combining him with the fact that he's one of the smoothest and best pull-up jump shooters in the league, where he has one of the highest volumes in terms of like how much he's shooting it, and he's pretty solid. One of the more efficient mid-range shooters, especially. That's awesome. And the three-point game is coming around, and he had a pretty solid year last season. Not incredibly efficient quite yet from three, but I do think it's coming there. It's coming around for Cade. So I rave about Cade. I love Cade Cunningham. I think if he was in a much better situation up to this point, he would be talked about closer to like a Tyrese Halliburton in terms of how we, kind of the media talks about Halliburton. I think Halliburton's probably the better player right now, just the impact, the passing, the three-point shooting, etc. But I don't think Cade's that far off. And I think maybe a better comparison is I don't think Cade's that far off from a Tyrese Maxey, who gets a ton of praise and deservedly so, but I don't think he's that far off from a Tyrese Maxey. So Cade continues to stay healthy. The arrow's pointing up, and they gave him that massive contract, and freaking deservedly so, man. Cade's the man. He's awesome. If the Pistons jerseys didn't stink, sorry, I don't want to rib on Pistons fans any longer. I'm not a fan of their jerseys, so that's the reason why I don't own a Cade jersey right now. But damn, he's awesome. And maybe I'll just have to buy, I think it was their alternate jersey, or like maybe this jersey that you guys see Jalen Duren wearing on the graphic right now. So I mean, if you couldn't tell, I love Cade Cunningham. And a guy that I adored, which is somehow more than loved, going back to the 2022 draft class, is Jaden Ivey. I was a big Jaden Ivey fan, to the point that I had a top 5 grade, a real top 5 grade on him. If I recall correctly, my draft board, at least the top 5 that year, was it was Paulo, it was Chet, it was Jabari, and it was Jaden Ivey, then Keegan Murray at 5. So I had a real top 5 grade on Jaden Ivey, and he is entering, along with Jalen Duren, a very, 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 very pivotal year 3 in his career. He is still probably one of the 5 or so quickest players with the ball in their hands in the entire league, where he has truly game-changing and game-breaking speed. It actually doesn't make any sense with Jaden Ivey. And one of my draft takes with Jaden Ivey was, man, it'll be fun to watch him with the NBA level floor spacing, because if you watch Big Ten basketball, it is a lot of times not a pleasure. And he was at Purdue, and I think Matt Painter is a fine coach, but even then, at times you could tell, like, man, this is a little bit rough. And somehow it's been worse than it was at college for Jaden Ivey, which is just somehow, it's just ridiculous. Again, dealing with some of the worst floor spacing. His rim shot quality isn't as bad as Cade's. It's still really, really bad. I think Cade's in like the 5th percentile in the entire league, which again is just downright awful. And I went on ball creators there. So if you want on ball creators, I guess Cade's in the 1 percentile. Jaden Ivey's in the 20th percentile or so. So they're both, I mean, Jaden Ivey, to just be plain, also has egregiously bad rim shot quality. And you can imagine dealing with that has been tough for him to really kind of flourish on the offensive end of the floor. But I am holding on by a thread, I think, to all my Jaden Ivey stock. And he's fun. He's fun. He's a really, really fun player. He's still, despite all these things that they've surrounded him with, or, lack thereof at this point, he's still a supremely talented finisher and driver, where he's able to change his angles and finish athletically around the basket, and at times even through contact. He's a talented playmaker with still room to improve with his ball handling and making reads. There's times we have like these really weird just spatial awareness issues, where he doesn't know how to manipulate the space that the defense might give him, or he doesn't know how to manipulate the space that if he's facing a drop coverage, and There's that pocket there to counter it. Doesn't really know how to, navigate that at times. They ran some really fun like Miami action last season for Jaden Ivey. Miami action is a corner dribble handoff into a ball screen, angled ball screen preferably. I think it really allows Jaden Ivey to get downhill and with the floor spacing this season. And that's why I'm such a big fan of the Simone Fontecchio trade pickup and getting Tobias Harris, because those two guys in the corners with Cade and Ivy kind of penetrating and attacking downhill. Ivy, another great driver in terms of drives per 75 possessions. Like, that's going to be fun. That's going to be really, really fun. And I think there is a nice floor, I think, for Jay and Ivy. And comparing him to his 2022 classmate in Jalen Duren, and we kind of brought this up with in my interview with Bryce. There is a world where Jaden Ivey is just a really good 6-man level player. And that's fine at the end of the day. I don't know if it doesn't pan out with Jalen Duren. I think it's just not going to pan out, even though I grade Jalen Duren a tad bit higher. But this is an important year. This is an important year for Jaden Ivey. He showed some improvement as a shooter, not anywhere near confident in that all the way yet. Similarly to Cade, I think Cade's probably still the better shooter right now. One last note, Detroit ran some really cool actions last season with Jaden Ivey as a screener and allowing him to attack off the catch and attack with the defensive rotation. I'd like to see them go to that a little bit more this season. That would be really, really cool to see, like, Jaden attacking it in space a little bit more often, even when the ball's not in his hands. I think in general, he can be better with just attacking off a close-ups. And again, some of the spatial awareness and just floor awareness in general leaves some to be desired, but I'm still holding on to my Jaden Ivey stock. I'm still a fan of Jaden Ivey's. I'm not giving up hope yet. And one of the reasons why I haven't given up hope is because they are actually surrounding Jaden Ivey and Cade Cunningham with two pieces that really should be able to help out and contribute. And I think they'll contribute right away. And that brings me to Simone Fontecchio. And this was a super underrated trade deadline acquisition as far as like what Fontecchio does well. This team desperately needed at the deadline last season. He has great floor awareness to transition where he just sprints his freaking ass off to get to the corner. And that should really open a floor up in transition again for driving lanes for Cade and Jaden. I'm really, really excited for that. And he's a lethal spot up weapon, especially in the quarters, like I mentioned, shooting 41% on corner threes last season as a whole. But more importantly, a ridiculous 52% on corner threes once arriving to Detroit. And they can run some same side action with Cade attacking a gap, and it's, Simone Fontecchio in that same side corner and really making the defense pick its poison, because now it's, Jalen Duren as a lob threat. It's Simone Fontecchio in that same side corner. And it's Cade Cunningham, who we already established as one of the best drivers in the entire NBA. Then yeah, this Pistons team has the opportunity to really, really do some fun stuff offensively with the guy like Fontecchio paired with Cade and just better floor spacing in general. He really flashed the ability to be an off-screen threat using flares and pin down some stagger screen stuff while with the Jazz. And it'll be fun and cool to see JB Bickerstaff tap into this some with Simone Fontecchio. Note that the Cavs were 10th in off-screen usage last season, coming in at around 4%. Now, I will like to also add that a lot of the league in general, unless you're like the Utah Jazz, unless you're the Golden State Warriors, who were both abnormally high, both teams coming in at 10% or higher. Unless you're one of those two teams, the league average is somewhere between 3.5% and 4% anyway. So, food for thought. But I would like to see to see the Pistons and JB Bickerstaff tap into this a little bit more. Like, can you imagine this team running like double drag shallow action, where I'll try to put like a clip of this on the screen right here of an example of what double drag shallow looks like. But essentially, think of it as Cade Cunningham as the ball handler, Jalen Duren's the first screener, and Simone Fontecchio is the second screener. They run this a lot in Utah. As Cade comes off that first ball screen from Duren, it's a shallow cut from Fontecchio, flaring back out to the perimeter, to the wing, especially if it's the empty side, back out to the wing. You have Duren rolling to the basket, and they have Cade driving downhill, preferably to his right, running this on the left side. So Cade can make all the passes in the book. So anyway, I'm basically saying they can run some fun stuff here with Simone Fontecchio, and I'm going to be curious to see if they can get some three-man actions going and develop some of that chemistry with Jalen Duren, with Cade Cunningham. And they also go out and make a pretty noticeable like splash in free agency, getting Tobias Harris on a 2-year, $52 million contract to come back to Detroit. And I want to say my initial reaction to this signing was very, that's just kind of mid. I'm not gonna lie. And it didn't sound pretty at the moment. It just didn't sit right with me at the moment of the signing. You know, he kind of left Philly on a sour note. And honestly, I don't want to sound like I'm this Tobias Harris stan all of a sudden, because it'd be really weird if those exist, and it probably does. But if we're being honest, I think a lot of the issues with Tobias Harris as a player, or the perception of Tobias Harris as a player, is the whole kind of situation with Jimmy Butler and how that ended in Philly. I'm not blaming Jimmy necessarily, but when organizationally the Philadelphia 76ers essentially said, look, we'll rather have you, Tobias, and deal with the headache in air quotes of Jimmy Butler, despite what our star wants. And also, I don't really think Ben and Jimmy got along. I feel like that's been reported at this point, but neither here nor there. And then you have that infamous playoff series, the Sixers Heat series, where the Heat went, I want to say it was 6 games, and Jimmy in the tunnel after winning that series says Tobias Harris over me, and he says some other words that I won't say right now, but that, I think, and then you combine that with the fact that Tobias hasn't had a couple of good playoff runs. Now he had a really, I don't even want to say inconsistent, because that would just be being nice with Tobias, but he had a pretty bad series against New York. And then we only averaged 9 points, not very efficient. He had a shaky at best series against Boston last year, where they got eliminated in 7 games, including an awful potential, game ceiling or series ceiling game 6 loss to Boston, where I want to say only had 2 points in 42 minutes. Wasn't the best in that Heat series. So you combine all these noteworthy performances, and that's how you can really bring down his stock, where in reality, the Pistons aren't a playoff team anytime soon, in my opinion. At least not, definitely, I don't think this year for sure. So if we are worried about that for this Pistons team, then I think we're fine, because in a vacuum, Tobias Harris, I think, really, really fits what this team needs, where Jaden Ivey doesn't attack closeouts, where Jaden and Cade are somewhat suspect off-ball players as of right now. Cade, I think, is rather fine, but Jaden, there's a lot of work to be done there. So we trade for Simone Fontecchio at the deadline. Cool, but now let's go get Tobias Harris, and they had to fill in the money somewhere for this year, because this year's team, you take out Tobias Harris, Cade's contract kicks in next year, so this is a fairly cheap team. You had to spend the money, and what you get is a guy that just feels a massive need for you. He shot at least 40% on corner threes for the past 7 seasons now. That would go back to the 2017-2018 season. That is how long Tobias Harris has been shooting 40% from 3 in the corners. To add more context, LeBron James was still a Cleveland Cavalier. That's how long ago it was. Kevin Durant just won Finals MVP. That's how long ago it was since we last saw. Kawhi Leonard was still a San Antonio Spur. That is how long it was. Or that's how long it's been since the last time we've had a season where Tobias Harris didn't shoot, above 40% from 3 in the corners, right? I think I got my point across at this point. He's a 80th percentile score on spot up attempts. Again, counting off ball possessions. We're talking the catch and shoot threes. We're talking the ability to attack closeouts and finish around the basket. Where, like I say, he's lights out in the corner, play off of closeouts. Capable, more than capable, actually, of attacking mismatches in the post and getting to the rim, or hitting and elevating mid-range jumpers over them. This is, again, a perfect fit here in Detroit, who desperately needs a versatile off-ball piece that could play around their star, and hopefully stars in like Asar, or who we're going to get to, or a Jaden Ivey and Cade, obviously, right? He'll be a fine fit next to Jalen Duren. And I think that if they make Tobias like this spot up threat, this spot up off ball guy that can knock out catches, shoot threes, play off of closeouts, beat him a post up touch here and there, don't need to see a lot of it. Please don't overfeed him. And then you let Fontecchio kind of be this dynamic shooting threat. They, in the starting five, or if it's Malik Beasley instead of Fontecchio, whatever, they can really kind of turn this thing around with their offensive spacing and go from one of the worst spacing, like groups of spacing in the NBA, to at least middle of the pack. And I think that's all you're asking for from this Pistons squad. And then we get to Jalen Duren, who is one of the best rebounding bigs in the NBA if you look at any rebounding advanced metrics. Great technique, insane explosiveness for a guy that's actually pretty undersized. I will say he's only 6'10", and has great, dare I say, like, I was going to say elite. I think I'm going to stay with great, but, point being, he has great chemistry with Cade Cunningham. And that's been one of the better things to watch with the Pistons these past years, too, is kind of that Cade and Jalen Duren pick and roll chemistry where I think they really play off each other nicely. You can kind of say the same for Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren on a little bit of a lesser scale. It's just because the Cade's just a better playmaker and things like that. Cade could also, going back to Cade discussion, he could turn down the turnovers just a little bit. He's slowly, and I mean like moving at a snail's pace type slow, showed the flashes to hit jumpers in the short roll. That was something I scouted when he came out of Memphis was, hey, there's something there. Like maybe for the grace of God, you could tap into it, but I wouldn't bet on it. And he's kind of proven me right. Last season, you saw a pretty substantial step forward in terms of Jalen Duren's free throw shooting ability, where, last season with Jalen Duren, the first season where Jalen Duren shot, pretty poorly from the free throw line, shot 61%. Last season, he shot 79% from the line. So you're hoping that can translate to the mid-range game a little bit more and help him be more of a floor spacer in some regards for this Pistons offense. But the motor has been a severe concern for Jalen Duren since he's came out of Memphis, and that's something we're definitely going to have to touch on when we get to the defense here. And then you combine that with the fact that he's been a mostly negative floor spacer and and passer in general. He's shown, again, flashes of the ability to make reads, but it's still super, super underdeveloped at this point. And I think he's actually behind the eight ball because he's heading into year 3. And I feel like at this point, as an NBA player that was a top 15 pick or so in that 2022 draft class, if you're not showing real progression by year 3, I think, that team that drafted you is probably going to give up on you at that point. I think you have a 3-year window. So it's going to be a really, 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 really important year 3 for Jalen Duren. Really good screener, athletic as hell around the basket, great lob threat for Cade. But, just got to start seeing, real development from Cade Cunningham. That's going to be a tall task for JB Bickerstaff with both Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren. And then getting to this bench, I like some guys here on this bench. I'm not going to lie to y'all. I mean, as you guys can tell, I like a lot of the guys here in Detroit. Marcus Sasser, I can't rank him too highly, but talk about another guy. The Pistons draft all the players I actually like, but they just never really make a ton of sense. Marcus Sasser, Bryce made up a good point that they really did play him a lot in on-ball roles last season, and I would like to see Marcus Sasser being used a little bit more off-ball this season and kind of tapping into his off-ball shooting and things like that, which, again, I think this team could really, really use. But with that being said, I mean, he got the on-ball reps with good reason last season. He shot nearly 42% on pick-and-roll threes last season. He shot, 35% on spot-up threes, which is fine. He's a 53rd percentile spot-up scorer. Last season he shot 39.5% on contested or guarded catch and shoot threes. So, and as you guys can see here, they're in terms of like point guard room depth, it's kind of thin. It's not a kind of, it's really thin here. Maybe they'll play it and they might tinker and play some stuff with like Asar Thompson being the point at times. But in terms of true point guard depth, it is short here. in Detroit. So they got to really stagger a Jaden Ivey and a Cade Cunningham and not, they'll start together, maybe finish games together. But outside of that, you have to stagger those two because your depth is pretty thin. But the arrow is definitely pointing up on Marcus Sasser. I love his game a ton. One of the more fun players to watch on this Pistons team last season. And already had a pretty high assist percentage, 26.3% assist percentage. Reel back in that turnover percentage just a little bit. We'll be all right. Good, solid finisher around the rim for a guy that's, he's, I guess, average height for a guard. So Marcus Sasser, the arrow's pointing up. And then you have Malik Beasley, who I think actually got pretty misused last season. I mean, at least defensively for sure. In Milwaukee, where Milwaukee kind of said, hey, look, we're going to turn you into, I don't know, a wing stopper all of a sudden. And for God's sakes, man, will a team freaking use Malik Beasley as a movement shooter more? Like Malik Beasley being in the 36th percentile for off-screen threes is a joke. But he was effing elite last season on spot up threes. 45.5% on spot up threes last season, 47.6% on transition threes. He was flat out incredible last season. If you can, another guy where if you can get that level of shooting on this Pistons team, they're cooking. And Malik Beasley, after a couple of down years from the corner, Malik Beasley last season shot 46% on corner threes last season. And oh, by the way, he got up 228 attempts from the corner as well. So a high volume, great efficiency shooter. Another guy that I think this team could really tap into from like an off-screen perspective. Fine NBA player at this point. They give him a pretty solid contract for a guy of his caliber. And then, Asar Thompson, freak athlete, one of the best athletes in the NBA in general. His, one step with the ball in his hands is actually pretty fine. But his, the jump that he has from a guy like Asar Thompson is just flat out elite. Really fast, really good lateral mover. Obviously, the shot is a severe work in progress. They did make an effort by hiring a new shooting coach this summer, so hopefully that changes some stuff there. They did some really cool stuff with Asar Thompson, using him as a screener last season, so hopefully that can continue. But I love Asar Thompson. I'm actually going to put the arrow up on Asar Thompson as well. And then they have Ron Holland, a guy that I don't want to say I was low on Ron Holland at the start, but I was like, oh, okay, good player and whatnot. But, we'll see. But, you have to put the G League Ignite into its own kind of context, if you will, right? And when reevaluating Ron Holland, I mean, at the end of the day, he is day one a really, really good NBA athlete with incredible explosion on drives and ability to finish above the rim. Nearly 45% of his shot attempts, I want to say the half court, were at the rim, and he's able to use his 6'6" frame and athleticism to finish around the basket. Flash, really, really nice ability. And I think you could tell he got comfortable as his G League Ignite season kind of continued. With his ability to hit pull-up jumpers out of ball screens or on drives and things like that, working ISO, and started really, really get comfortable knocking down shots in the mid-range, or at least taking those shots. He doesn't trust the pull-up three quite yet, or the three-point shot at all necessarily right now. And needs to turn some of the turnovers. He can get pretty sloppy with some of the handle at times, and I do think he can work on his offhand, which would really, really help him as a finisher, where I think he is kind of a one-handed finisher right now. He can, work on the offhand. It really, really will help him out. We'll talk about the defense here in just a sec, but offensively, he's a guy that can project in its highest of highest ceilings to be a Jaylen Brown, which would be a top 20 player on the planet, a two-wing star that any team would want and would pair perfectly with a guy like Cade Cunningham. And I mean, my pro card for not for Jaylen Brown, for a Ron Holland, more medium level pro comp was like a Cam Whitmore, who I also adored last season in last year's draft process. So I'm high on Ron Holland, even though the fit I'm not like insane about. they did do a fairly decent job of like kind of correcting that and going after Tobias Harris, getting it. You already have Fontecchio. Sasser's a good shooter. Malik Beasley's a good shooter. They bring in Tim Hardaway Jr., who might be a shot chucker, but I mean, hey, he's a good shooter, streaky shooter actually at that, if we're being completely honest. But fine signing. And then Isaiah Stewart and Paul Reed, solid big depth. I'm not raving about either one necessarily, but Paul Reed, 36.8% 3-point shooter last season. Paul Reed is a really, really good offensive rebounder in the 96th percentile of an offensive rebounder. Coming off a season where he's in the 99th percentile as an offensive rebounder. So he's really, really fun. And then Isaiah Stewart, who is kind of that floor spacing big, especially last season. Like, that's legit, where he shot 38.5% on spot up threes last season. From three in general last season. So this is a really, really unique group of guys. And really quickly, Isaiah Stewart shot 35% on catch and shoot threes, 38% unguarded. So they I think have actively worked to kind of reshape this roster. It's still a work in progress, and they need some of these guys to take that next step. But kudos to the front office, kudos to the new management, and JB Bickerstaff has something to work with here in Detroit. Let's touch on the defense, because there are some guys I want to talk about here. I think really quickly, Tobias Harris is more Fontecchio. I can't rank too highly, but I think they're fine defenders. And for this starting five, definitely justifies them starting, in my opinion. Two guys that can guard in space, hold their own, while not being incredibly great defenders. They definitely can hold their own in space and, to some degree help out like a Cade and a Jaden Ivey. And then you have Asar and Marcus Sasser and Ron Holland off the bench. Malik Beasley, I may be giving him a little bit of the short end of the stick, but guys that are capable defenders. But you're seeing a lot of yellows and a blue and, green, a couple of greens on this screen. So why, Sean, are the Pistons only in my, fifth tier for defense, barely cracking into the top 20? Along with the fact that, like, they have, like I said, a really good defensive-minded head coach that I think can help raise the level or raise the floor of this team defensively. And I mean, it really just comes down to, and actually, check it, they are Pistons are 19th for me for defense, so they are right at the back of this, kind of tier for me with defense, and it's really just Jalen Duren. And because my belief, at least defensively, is that you really, really need to be a good defense. And that's why when I briefly look over kind of my top like 14-ish defenses in the NBA, with the exception of one team that didn't make that cut, which would be San Antonio, all the teams in my top 14 have either like several elite wings that can defend, several. So not like Asar Thompson and Ron Holland who might play. Several. So, example, New Orleans Pelicans, Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, like they have dogs in New Orleans, right? So outside of that, almost all these teams have elite, or like another example, that would be like the Magic, right? Wendell, Franz, Wendell's a big, but Jonathan Isaac, more importantly, I guess is the better example. All of these teams have great bigs, or at the very least, good defensive bigs. And the Pistons, I can safely say, out of any team having my top 20 defensively, the Pistons have the worst defensive big in the entire top 20. At any team having my top 20 defense, they have the worst defensive big in the NBA out of those teams. And with Jalen Duren, it's really it's a combination of a few different things, right? He is not, because he is, like I said, fairly undersized. I don't want to give him too much bail there, because you look at a guy like a Bam, who is also undersized, or Draymond, who is undersized. Draymond's a stretch five, kind of been that way. But you get my point. Those guys are undersized. But I think, and I don't want to ever say a guy just isn't smart, unless I just truly think you're like not a smart dude. But Jalen Duren defensively, and I asked Bryce about this in the interview, it's the motor. I think there's just plays where he just actively looks like he doesn't give a shit. And that's truly the best way to describe that when you watch Jalen Duren. He doesn't contest on shots at times. He is in no man's land at times defensively. And it's actually a frustrating watching Jalen Duren defensively. He's as good of a rebounder he is just not at all as active as he should be around the basket. One of my biggest pet peeves with drop bigs, and this is something I watch for a lot with drop bigs, it's the ability to kind of play both. Like if you're in the drop, so essentially when you're the drop big, it is your responsibility to be there to help contain the drive until the guy who's guarding the ball handler gets back in front of his man. Then it's your job to retrieve back to your man. Try to keep the action as 2-on-2 as possible. That's why having a great screen navigator is also important, because if you have a great screen navigator, then in theory, the big should be able to just stay home with his man and not really even come up to the level or whatever at all. Well, let's say you have a bad screen navigator and I have to kind of show my hands a little bit more and, also still know there is a guy rolling behind me trying to dunk on my face. I have to still protect the rim while also showing. I think Anthony Davis, I think Bam, I think Wemby, they are the best players on the planet at that, right? Jalen Duren is flat out awful in that regard. It just boils down to a lack of activity. He doesn't show his hands at all. He doesn't really have great contest. Again, it is a painful watching Jalen Duren defensively at times. And I really like Jalen Duren coming out of Memphis, but like I said, the motor was a legitimate issue, and it just seems like he hasn't really fixed it quite yet, and that's really, really unfortunate for Jalen Duren. And that, not the offense. Screw the offense. It's the lack of offensive space yet. It's the lack of the offensive spacing. It's the lack of real playmaking ability, or at least neutral level playmaking ability. Plus the fact that you are a bad defensive big. So you combine all those three things. And that's why and that's why it is a big issue with Jalen Duren. And that's why he's under a tremendous amount of pressure heading into this year 3. And this might be one of JB Bickerstaff's best projects, if you will, if it really pans out, is, hey, look, I got Jalen Duren to be an average defender. Oh, man, did JB Bickerstaff deserves an award, because that's how painful of a watch it is watching Jalen Duren play defense at times. And then Asar Thompson. Asar Thompson is, truly, like I said, just an incredible defensive prospect. He's a rare and special physical athlete. His timing and instincts around the ball is just flat out ridiculous, where he's able to create deflections and turnovers with the best of them. Has insanely good positional versatility, where you can literally watch him one possession go from guarding the best player on the floor, like guarding a Luka, for an example. I think he actually did really, really well guarding Luka, to, the next possession, he's now guarding the weak side corner, and he's now tasked with defending the rim on the weak side. And he has the wingspan, the athletic pop, and I think you really, really see it defensively, where he could just jump out the gym and send shots flying or contest at the rim. He's also a really, really good rebounder. I mean, Asar Thompson is a really, really unique prospect. And if he can turn that offensive side of the floor around, I think he could turn into one of the most insane two-way players in the league. And hey, if Herb Jones is able to do it, so can Asar Thompson. One very, very, very small nitpick is, I think at times the technique is still a little bit raw, and you can see him overcommit in, maybe trying to be a little too, maybe try to gamble a little too much in the passing lanes, or gamble too much on ball, and it can get him beat, or the offensive player gains a significant advantage and it unnecessarily puts the defensive rotation. That is a very small nitpick. It's not something to be overly concerned about. But once every 6 plays, maybe that's still a lot. Like every once in a while, to the point where it's noticeable. Like, all right, why do we just try to gamble there, and force him to reject the screen, and he just uses it anyway, and now you're beat or something, or he's playing too high when guarding a player in ISO. again, very rare. It's noticeable, but it doesn't happen a ton to where, okay, we have to be worried about that with Asar. So, and then, bringing it back around to Ron Holland, defensively, I mean, I think his defensive upside is actually ridiculous. And that's where the Jaylen Brown comp comes in. Because I think his on-ball defensive technique might actually be better than Ron Holland's, and than Asar's, and that is incredibly high praise. But the reason why I said that is I think Asar is the way superior gifted athlete. I think Asar is the better athlete, hands down, right? I think Asar's technique is good, but I think Ron Holland's technique day one might actually be at least on par with Asar's, if not potentially beating it. It's really fun to watch, and his ability to navigate ball screens is incredible. I thought that was one of his best traits when watching him as a defensive prospect, and it's going to make him a really high quality defender day one. It's just going to be about can he consistently find ways to get on the floor. Isaiah Stewart, Paul Reed, fine backup bigs. Not they're really to write home about, but I think they are both significant upgrades defensively over a Jalen Duren. And, this is the side of the floor that's really going to either hold Jalen Duren back or you're like, okay, cool. The defense is somewhat fixed. We could justify paying him now or something. You can't be, again, a negative floor spacer, a bad passer, and a just egregiously bad defender. So that's going to be the kind of the conversation, if you will, around Jalen Duren heading into this very pivotal year 3. But before we get to our interview, let's wind down here with our strengths and weaknesses for this Pistons team and take a look at some of the Vegas odds using FanDuel. And we'll start this off with the strengths. This is a team that has, I think, a decent amount of strengths and weaknesses. I think the number one strength, and again, it's the biggest reason why I think I have the Pistons, so high at freaking 24th. And I think they have a legitimate number one offensive option. More so than arguably any of the other teams we've talked about up to this point, even more than like a Utah Jazz, even though Cade and Laurie coming with the same grade for me, are a Scotty Barnes and, Toronto, even though once again, actually not Lowry Markkinen has a higher grade by a point than Cade. But, that's neither here nor there. But Scotty, right? I trust Cade more as a number one option than any of the other teams below the Pistons, any more than their number one options. Cade is incredible, and his upside as a player, once this team kind of starts to figure out what they're doing, it's ridiculously high, man. He has still upside to be a top 5 guard on the planet. And I hope that this team is in the right direction and we get to finally see Cade show the rest of the league why he is this damn good. And it wouldn't surprise me based off how the league gives out the most improved player award if, let the Pistons win 35 games or whatever, and they're like the 10th seed and they make the play-in, that Cade Cunningham is in most improved player conversations because the NBA does not know how to use and give out the most improved player award. Actually, not think about it, that award's probably going to get given to Wemby. So, hey. Anyway, moving on. Defensive coaching, I think, is actually a legitimate strength. Like I said, I think they have one of the 10-ish best defensive minds in the NBA. Some of the stuff he was able to do with Cleveland was really fun. And I think he has some of the defensive talent. He does have Evan Mobley and Jared Allen, but he does have Asar and Ron Holland and, a couple of backup bigs are serviceable defensively. And then I really like their wing depth here. I think Asar, Simone Fontecchio, Ron Holland, Tobias Harris, Tim Hardaway Jr. is kind of a 2-3, but sure, wing. Malik Beasley played a lot of, wing minutes in Milwaukee last season. So they have for sure 4 guys that they could turn to for that wing spot. And then you add in maybe a couple of tweeners and they have real, like, legitimate wing depth here in Detroit. And I'm a fan of the new direction. Again, at the end of the day, I think, I think JB Bickerstaff is a fine coach. I have him ranked tied for 20th at the end of the day. But I think this is the appropriate hire because they don't need another high upside hire right now. They need let's get the damn franchise turned around type hire. And that is what JB Bickerstaff is at the end of the day. Really solid floor. Not the craziest ceiling, but I think he can kind of reestablish the franchise. I hope reestablish the franchise. getting rid of Trey Weaver, making that front office shift as well, I think is also going to be a big deal. Weaknesses, I think in general, the defensive talent, specifically, I'm talking about, Jalen Duren. We didn't touch on it a ton, but their guard room for defense is not that great either. Your best defensive guard is Marcus Sasser. Like Beasley might be even better than both of those guards. So I think the defensive talent is definitely an issue. I think the fit concerns are real, and I'm mostly talking about the young core, because you look at the young core, it's kind of hard to figure out how they all kind of mesh together, because it's Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, Asar Thompson, Ron Holland, and Jalen Duren. And individually, there's something or a lot of things in most cases that I like about all those players individually. But if that's a young core, that is a really, really, really weird fit amongst those guys, where there isn't this one true floor spacer. And, Cade's probably the best spacer out of that entire group, and that's honestly an issue. And that's why the Ron Holland pick, I was a massive Ron Holland fan, and I did give it a good grade because I love Ron Holland. He was the second highest graded player on my board. But I do think that, like, with Ron Holland, with that pick, there was a level of that makes sense, because as much as I'm praising them for getting Fontecchio or actually keeping him around, they gave him an extension. Getting a Tobias in free agency, Malik Beasley, etc. It's the young core that's going to matter here at the end of the day for Detroit. And as of right now, there are real fit concerns with that group. The guard rotation minus Cade and Ivy, like, God forbid one of those guys go down and you're really, really thin all of a sudden. That is a real concern of mine. And then the offensive coaching. As much as we praise the defensive coaching with JB Bickerstaff, the offensive side of the floor, as we kind of illustrated, has been a concern in previous stops for JB. So can JB learn from his mistakes and kind of modernize his, offensive philosophies, play with a little bit more pace, shoot a little bit more threes with the added floor spacing they have here in Detroit? So, and let's really quickly, we did do this last episode, but let's check kind of the Vegas odds here. So similarly to a lot of the teams of this tier, the Pistons have plus 100,000 odds per FanDuel to win an NBA championship. To win the conference finals, the Detroit Pistons, they have the second worst odds in the East right now, plus 50,000 odds to win the Eastern Conference. And to make the playoffs in general, the Pistons are plus 1,300 to make the playoffs, and their over-under for the season per FanDuel, the Detroit Pistons are set at 25.5 wins. I'm doing this live. The odds aren't great. Like 25.5 wins is minus 122. That's not great, but if you want an easy win and maybe you combine that with a couple other stuff, like I really, really think this Pistons team gets 30 wins. I think that's actually low, and rightfully so. They had an awful year last season, but I like this Pistons team. If they shock the entire world and make the play-in game next season, everybody's like, man, who saw this coming? I want you guys to refer back to this video, because I'm a believer in what they got building here in Detroit. And yeah, I'm excited. So thank you guys so much for watching and tuning in to another episode of this preseason Power Ranking series. Make sure you guys hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Number 23 comes out this week. I'm going to try to get number 22 out as well sometime this week. Working on my top 25, under 25 rankings list as well. Gonna have some 2K25 content when that drops. A bunch of stuff is happening here on this channel. No better time to subscribe than right now. So make sure you guys hit that like button. And with that being said, let's get to our great interview with my guy, Bryce Simon. See you guys next time. Enjoy. All right, everybody, I want to welcome you guys into our post-breakdown interview with my guy, friend of the show. We've had a bunch of great conversations in the past. My guy, Bryce Simon. You guys can follow all his work with Pistons Pulse. I didn't botch that, did I? Yeah, no, I got that right. Okay. Yeah. Pistons Pulse. He's the host of the Game Theory podcast with Sam Vecini. They do a bunch of great stuff, especially during draft season. Go check him out. He put his Twitter handle or X handle right there at Motor City Hoops. Bryce, my guy, thank you so much for hopping on here and talking about this Pistons team that I'm apparently incredibly high on.
No, what's up, Sean? No, it's good to be here. As you mentioned, we get to talk hoops all the time now. This is one thing I love about content creation is you go on a podcast, you talk with somebody, and then afterwards you're like, man, I feel like there was good chemistry there. So I'm gonna hit him up with the DM, and then you exchange phone numbers, and now we can just text anytime we want and talk hoops, which I really enjoy. And listen, I still call it Twitter. Today, we were talking about before we recorded, we both started school. So today was my first day of school with my junior high students. And I said Twitter, and I was waiting for one of them to cook me. Like, that's not what it's called, Mr. Simon. But I don't even think junior high kids are on Twitter. They're on TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, that stuff. So,
yeah. Yeah, it's actually crazy. But the Pistons coming in here for me, 24th in the power ranking series. Again, somehow that is me being crazy high on them. Gut reaction, I tell you that the Pistons come in 24th for me.
Yeah, so I'm thinking I could see them being better than at least one team in the West, which would leave 29, 28, 27, 5 teams in the East. So I think this is the high end. Like, this is where I think if you're high on the Pistons and where they're going to be this year, I think this is about as high as you can get, is them flirting with the play-in. I think that would be a really successful season. As scary and as sad as that sounds, Sean, people have to remember this team won 14 games last year. Now the roster is way better constructed. I believe there is a new coach, like all of that stuff, some guys getting older. But I think, if this team is anywhere close to the play-in, I think things went really well, and that's a positive step in the right direction.
So for some background, I have the Pistons above the Raptors, the Bulls, and the Nets and the Wizards, in the East. Wait, yeah, Raptors, Bulls, yeah, Nets, Wizards. In the West, I have them above the Jazz, I have them above the
Blazers. Okay, yeah. So only saying one Western Conference team was probably not enough, right? Like that Utah team, even with Lowry staying around, the rest of that roster is a little bit funny. Do they eventually sell on Collins and Clarkson? So I could see 2 teams in the West. And then the East, I mean, I think that the Wizards and the Nets, obviously, as much as anybody, hopefully they're better than the Nets this year. And then who knows what the Bulls do, right? Like, do they eventually move Levine? Does this stuff work even if they don't? Vooch. And then the Raptors, and whether it's the Raptors,
I'm just lower on them, I think.
Sure. Yeah. And whether it's them or somebody else, some team's going to have some sort of injuries or, sell on the season at the deadline, whatever. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't think that this is crazy to have them in this area. It's just, I do think having them much higher than this would take a lot of conversation to get there.
Well, let's start things off. The Pistons made a pretty big decision this summer. They said, hey, remember that guy we gave a 6-year contract to? Hey, we're just going to fire him after 1 year. They hired JB Bickerstaff. I don't know about you, but I really, really wanted the Pistons to find a way to hire a guy like a David Adelman, who's the Nuggets like offensive coordinator, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
They hired JB Bickerstaff. What are your thoughts on the Bickerstaff hiring and the Monty Williams? I don't want to say 10-year because it's only a year, but what are your thoughts on kind of how that whole thing panned out?
I mean, the more I hear, and listen, I want to be very clear for your listeners and viewers. I'm not a beat writer. I'm not there every day. I don't have inside information with the organization, but my co-host is a beat writer. I talk to people. I watch every second of the game. So I feel like I am an expert in that way with Detroit. It didn't seem like this was a good tenure for Monty Williams. It did not seem like it was a good fit. When I go to games, I get credentialed, Sean. The one game I went to, I didn't feel like the energy was in the right place. Like, it just seemed a little bit off. And maybe that was just Monty's personality. The other thing where I will give Monty a little bit, he's dealing with some real life stuff off the court. Yeah. And that's why he initially turned this down. And then the money just got too much. And I think there was some other things that were offered to him and his family to get through that. But you know how this is when you're dealing with stuff off the floor, especially with your family, it affects things in your real life, in your real job. So I do want to give Monty a little bit there. Another thing is they had hired Dan Burke to be the defensive coordinator, quote unquote, for this team. He was there for 3 games last season, and then he had personal issues that he had to eventually leave the team for. So there was some of that. The roster, they fired Troy Weaver for a reason, or I guess he eventually resigned, but they hired over Troy Weaver.
Right.
Yeah, they hired over Troy Weaver for a reason. And so it wasn't great. JB, I agree with you. An offensive-minded coach would have been great. That would have been really cool. I hope one of these assistants emerges as that. Obviously, Fred Vincent came in as the shooting coach. What I like about JB is the defensive minded to improve some of these young guys in that area. And it seems like everywhere JB's been, his teams have gotten better, especially defensively. And the one big knock, Sean, is, oh, JB couldn't get his teams over the hump. I do not care. This team isn't need to get over this.
At the hump.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, if JB gets them to the hump and isn't able to get them over it, he was still a successful hire. And so with that in mind, I'm completely fine with this. I'm not over the moon, but I'm completely fine with it.
That's a great way of putting that. It's like, okay, cool. Can we just get the guy that can stabilize, like be the adult, stabilize this, get like these guys are still young. It's like best case scenario, the Pistons are what, 3 years away? Maybe 2, like maybe I'm talking about everything goes right. And by I mean 2 years away, like, okay, this team can win a playoff series, maybe. Best case scenario.
Yeah. So what? This is 24, 25. I don't think that's happening in 25, 26 in the
We're
best
talking
26, 27.
Exactly. So, okay. Now at that point, you're at the hump, you lose in the first round, but we're at the hump now. Okay, cool. We can fire JB. And like you're saying, like that would have still been a successful
100%.
tenure for JB, and he'll go get another job and do the same thing.
Yeah. No, it's the energy seems good. He's a younger coach. Like I say, the defense, but I do have concerns, right? Like the offensive concerns. I'm really hoping that JB playing 2 bigs was a product of the rosters he was given in Memphis. Obviously, it's worked in Memphis, but also in Cleveland, and that he doesn't try to do it with bigs in Detroit who don't fit. They're not Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen. They're not Triple J and Steven Adams or whoever.
Sure.
And so I hope he doesn't try that. And I do hope the pace and the idea of 3-point shooting and floor spacing continue. I think it got better this last year with Cleveland throughout the season, but that is my kind of concerns with him, is because they did go out and get spacing. I do think it's a team that needs to play with pace. But one thing I do like is, I think he's already mentioned staggering Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey, which is something all Pistons fans were just screaming for all of last season. So that's one huge thing I hope we do see.
So do you think that the Pistons addressed their biggest needs this offseason?
Yes, I do. I think they tried. I think Trajan tried. I would say my biggest concern for this team, they're not going to be any better defensively. Like JB may, work some miracles and make guys, but if they get better, if we see improvement, especially individually, I think on the defensive end, Sean, I want to see individual defensive improvement, specifically from JD, JI, and Cade. On the offensive end, I think this team has a chance to be a decent team offense, like middle of the pack in the NBA, because they went out and got real floor spacing. Tobias Harris has real gravity. People can make fun of Tobias Harris all they want.
And it's because of the contract. It's because Philly chose him over Jimmy, essentially. Like, he's fine. He's a fine player.
And it's because of the playoffs. But what's funny is he actually wasn't bad in the playoffs until this last season, if I remember correct. He wasn't he averaged 9 points in the playoffs this last year. Not good, right? Agreed. The year before, 15. The year before, 17. The year before, 22 on 49-37. So, and here's the other thing we just talked about. I don't care what Tobias Harris does in the playoffs, because he ain't playing in the playoffs for the Pistons on this 2-year contract probably. Know what he does do? He plays 70 games a year over the last 5 seasons, and he makes
shoot threes.
37% of his threes, especially from the corner, which is something this team could really use. So Tobias, Tim Hardaway Jr., same thing. Malik Beasley, same thing. They space the floor. Now, if we want to nitpick the process of how they acquired those guys or how much they gave Tobias, I'm all for it. But in general, bringing in those type of players, real floor spacers, Sean, all of those guys have played a lot of games the last 5 years. That's what this team needed on the offensive end.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's funny, kind of going back to the point about me being incredibly high in the Pistons. I've kind of ranked them decently high around this range each of the past 3 years. So hopefully, I mean, because this is the year, though, you brought up the 3-point shooting, and I almost said, ooh, Pistons and 3-point shooting. Seems like they've been allergic to that for a while now.
Yeah, for real.
But Fontecchio, getting him at the
That's another
deadline,
great one. Yep.
Tobias. But what's interesting is like Cade's a fine one. What's interesting is the Pistons have a bunch of guys on this team that I individually love. And I've tried different ways, like stick them in starting 5 iterations or whatever. And each time I go to you with the idea, like, hey, what do you think about this? No, Sean, let's stop. Specifically talking about Jaden Ivey, Asar Thompson, and Ron Holland. Ron Holland's insanely high on in this class. I mean, what do the Pistons kind of do with these three? Because like I said, I think individually they're all really, really good, and we'll kind of talk about Jaden a little bit more later on. But like, you just can't really play them together with some of the lineup combinations. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, I agree. So right now, I would consider, you talked about Cade. Let's go to the other 4 young guys. Jalen Duren's a non-floor spacer, right? Non-floor spacer. Asar Thompson, I would say right now, is a non-floor spacer.
Yep.
Ron Holland is borderline non-floor spacer / bad floor spacer, right?
Yep.
Like it just, judging, it kind of depends if he's able to do some volume or uptick his percentage. He was shooting from the NBA 3-point line in the G League. So maybe it's an easier transition. And then Jaden Ivey is a tick above those guys right now. So my point is, of those 4, you can't play 3 of them at the same time, Sean. You just cannot do it, or your floor spacing goes to heck. And what is really tough is, I think the 2 that you really struggle to play together are actually Asar and Jalen Duren. Because to me, that is almost 2 completely non-floor spacers that people don't have to guard. So I think you can play Jalen Duren and Jaden Ivey. I think you can play Ron Holland, Asar Thompson, or Ron Holland and Jalen Duren, or Asar and J.I. You just can't do the 2 big-time non-floor spacers, and you can't do 3 of them together.
Man, it's rough. Really fast. Looking at some clean the glass data here, the Detroit Pistons in corner 3-point percentage rank in the past 5 years, 27th, 18th, shocker, somehow they ranked 18th, 26th, dead last, and then somehow the year before this would have been the 1920 year. Is this the year Blake was an all-star? Because no, this had to be after, because
1920
Blake was the all-star 17-18. So I'm trying to remember like what this 1920 team was.
That was the year before I came. That was a Blake, because my first year was 2021.
Okay.
So 1920 was the COVID year.
Yep. Okay.
And that was the last year Blake actually played. Drummond was still on the team. Well, probably who really bumped that number was Luke Kennard was still on the team.
That's what it was. Yeah.
So if you look
second.
Svi played 56 games. Tony Snell played 59 games and shot 40%. Kennard at 40. Here's another one. Langston Galloway was on that team and shot 40%.
That's so a pull.
Brandon, I'm looking at
this.
This is not off the dome. I promise you that. Christian Wood was on that team, 62 games, shot 39%. So yeah, and that was, like I say, that was the year before I started doing this. And then that offseason they signed Jeremy Grant, and then going into that year, they eventually bought out Blake Griffin, traded Derrick Rose.
Yep.
They had just drafted Killian Hayes instead of Tyrese Halliburton. Say that very quietly. Sekou Doumbouya, Sadiq Bey, like that was that first year I covered it. That was the team. But yeah, they had some floor spacers that year before. That's interesting.
Yeah, and then you go through 4 years of hell being in the bottom of the league.
Yes, yeah.
Jeez.
To your point, Tobias over the last 2 years is over 40% on corner threes. Like,
yeah.
And Malik Beasley, Tim Hardaway Jr., like either, crazy volume, good percentages, whatever. Again, I don't know where this team is going to be defensively, but just in terms of being able to put guys on the floor that space it, they have done that between, this offseason and then Fontecchio last year at the deadline.
Yeah. Really fast. You look at, I'm going to see if I can really quickly pull it up. It would have been Cade. It might have been Cade, Ivey, Fontecchio, Isaiah Stewart, Jalen Duren, and that grouping, I want to say 186 minutes was a +9. They were that was a really good defensive group per clean the glass. 104.3 points allowed per 100 possessions. They didn't score that well, but that was an interesting group. You got some floor spacing like that. That can work.
Yeah, that's an interesting group. I am to the point with Stu where I don't love seeing him a lot at the 4. I think I'm hoping Stu gets to play the role I see for him this year, which is like first big off the bench. And depending on the opponent, maybe that is at the 4 sometimes, right? But a lot of times it's going to be at the 5. And I think his ability where, I don't know that a lot of people realize that Isaiah Stewart has really brought the jumper around. He shot 38% on almost 4 attempts. So we're not talking 1.5 attempts or 2 attempts from 3. That's on almost 4 attempts last year. Now, it was one sneaky thing with Stu and with Duren is games played. Stu's like right around 50 the last 2 years, and I think Duren's been around 60. He's had some ankle stuff. So that's another reason why bringing in Paul Reed as a third big, whenever one of those guys misses games or whatever, he's going to be able to come in and hopefully, provide something of value in his minutes as well.
So we got to talk about the face of the franchise right now. New bag man. Paid him a lot of money this summer. And if I had to make a list of like the 5 most underrated players, for me at least, number 1 is Trae. I think the way Trae Young gets talked about, like he's not a generational playmaker, is ridiculous. Cade is for a different reason. Like I feel like the Pistons have been so bad since Cade's been here. It's like, dog, you guys have like go. Your eyes might bleed by watching it, but look, go watch a Pistons game and watch how good Cade Cunningham actually is. So my question for you, Bryce, is this the year that Cade shows like, no, like that contract is absolutely warranted. I'm that dude. And, it's a reason why they're paying me this contract.
I think so. I mean, I did this trivia. I did it on the Pistons Pulse. I did it on Game Theory. I put it out there on Twitter. 6 guys last year that played more than 41 games averaged 22 and 7. 6.
I don't think I've seen this.
Luka, LeBron.
Hallie?
Nope. Didn't have the points.
Okay.
Luka, LeBron, Jokic.
Okay.
The guy you just mentioned that's also underrated, Trae Young.
Trae.
Dame, surprisingly. I would not. Dame's the one.
I would have guessed Dame.
And the 6 players, Cade Cunningham.
Yeah.
6 guys. That's pretty good company to average, 22 and 7. And his percentages went up. It's still not great, but he was 45% from the field. 36% from 3 this past season. He's good at the free throw line. He just doesn't get there enough. Like he's got to find a way to get to the free throw line more. But Cade Cunningham is very, very good. And I still say of all of those guys in his draft, he's the one that got thrust into being the absolute face of the franchise from day one. Now, Scotty Barnes is that now, right? Like Scotty Barnes will be asked to be the face of the Toronto Raptors franchise now. But when he got there, Siakam was there. Cade hasn't had that. He's battled some injuries. I think this is going to be a big year. I think this is a season. And if they win enough games, I think it'll really pop off. But I think they have the right roster around him. Like you can put some rosters, like some lineups out there. Go Tim Hardaway Jr., Fontecchio, Tobias Harris, Isaiah Stewart. Like you can almost go 5 out and just let Cade cook. Or give him Duren and play that pick and roll with 3 floor spacers. They've never been able to do that in the time that he's been on this team.
I think one of the common misconceptions with like 5 out, because I think 5 out immediately when you say 5 out, I think people go, oh, threes. And like, yeah, but not really, because I think what 5 out is, it's saying, hey, look, we're just going to space the floor all the way out. So you have a top 5 driver in the league currently in Cade Cunningham. Say, look, go create space for yourself. We're going to maximize his space by like playing with fun lineups like the ones you just mentioned. And that can kind of lead into his playmaking more. Again, stuff like that, I don't think you don't hear a ton because, again, the Pistons haven't been that great. So the spotlight isn't on Cade as much. If you're more than free to add on to that point. But if you had to add something like, okay, look, Cade heading into year 4, because, yeah, he's same draft as Scotty. Heading into year 4, let's focus offensively because I think defensively we can acknowledge that there's stuff to work on there. Is there anything particularly that you look at Cade, you're like, oh, man, let's add this or kind of recorrect this? And, man, it's going to be just over for the league. Is there anything?
Yeah, so real quick, whenever I think of 5 out kind of style that we're talking about here, I think of the Oklahoma City Thunder. And yes, the Thunder shoot a lot of threes, but the Thunder also top 5 or 6 in 2-point attempts. And the dude they do it for,
another example.
Yeah. And SGA is a guy that takes a lot of 2s, and a lot of them end up being from the mid range because he's so good from there. So Did you say, sorry, I was looking that up. So I heard you ask about Cade's improvement. Did you say not to bring up defense, or was that an option as well?
Yeah, not to bring up defense. I think we
Not
can
to,
acknowledge.
okay, all right. And I think it's an area where he could be good. You know what's an interesting one for me is how much can Cade play off the ball? That's what I'm interested here. I don't know that it's a have to. It's a, I think it would make him even better if he could do all of these on-ball things. But then let's say JI is what I think JI is, and you can put the ball in his hands. And now Cade's playing on the second side, attacking a scrambling defense. Yeah, in rotation. Whenever they drafted JI, that was what I envisioned, was JI breaking down the defense. Maybe you have a little flare or pin down or something on the weak side. And now Cade's catching the ball with an advantage where he can catch and shoot, attack a closeout, whatever. But now he's getting downhill. If he wants to stop for a mid-range, great. If not, he keeps going, makes those high-level decisions. I think that's what I'd like to see a little bit more. And I don't know where Cade is at on that. Maybe he doesn't want to do that. Maybe they haven't had the personnel where he's been comfortable doing it. But I think that would kind of round out his offensive game if there was a little bit more off the ball with him.
So Cade Cunningham last season, per Synergy, ranked in the 57th percentile for spot up scoring possessions. Shot 36.6% on spot up threes, which is fine. You would like that for spot ups alone. You would like that to be a little bit higher.
Yep.
But the thing is, this kind of goes to your point about, okay, does Cade really want to do this in terms of percentile, in terms of like how much is he using this, like, or like what he's only in the 13th percentile.
I was gonna say, I would have guessed below 10th percentile, so it's 13 is not surprising at all. Yeah,
so can we bump that number up to 30? Can we get like in the 30th percentile or whatever? One of the highest ball screen usage players in the league. He's phenomenal in that category. 16.8% turnover percentage. I'm trying to remember what the like league average is for ball screen turnover percentage. It's like 15, I think, right?
I mean,
or am I making that up?
Cade has had some issues, to be fair, with his turnovers, but I feel like they got better throughout the season last year, or he at least went through a stretch, if I remember correctly, towards the end of the year or at some point where it got better. So, I mean, there's no question that it's been an issue for him, but so that would be an area as well. But I think not taking every single on-ball rep may help him with that a little bit. And I know we didn't want to talk defense, but I think doing that also would leave a little bit more energy for him to be better on the defensive end.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Cade's fun. And if I would have Laker fans hounding me for having an Apollo jersey, I'd probably hang up a Cade one right next to that. Let's talk about, Mr. Jaden Ivey that you kind of alluded to there a little bit, that I had him back in the 22 class. I had him third on my board that year. That was the first year I evaluated prospects. I would cringe if I went back to look at some of my Scotty reports from then. But I had him third for that cycle. Heading into year 3, and there was a tweet, I think it was from Brett Usher, maybe on Twitter or whatever. It was just like 4 minutes. This was before I started like watching film for this series, or for this episode in particular. It was like 4 minutes of just Jaden Ivey with the ball in his hand, still being probably the quickest dude on the planet with the ball in his hands. I'm like, damn, I still believe in Ivey. What are your thoughts on Jaden Ivey? Can they, like with JB, kind of get this pairing to work still and kind of, embody kind of somewhat of your vision, what you just talked about there?
I hope, man. Like, this is probably the year. If it doesn't hit this year, then you probably got to do something, right? Because I'm not saying things can't work and guys can't improve, but then you start talking about extension conversations and stuff like that. And, one thing a lot of people like to do, and I've done it myself, is talk about, well, maybe JI is just a, 6 man, like he's just come off the bench. How many top 5 picks end up being the 6th man on the team that drafted them? Like, how often has that happened? It doesn't seem like it's very common. And so I hope we get to see him try to be what I envisioned, was he plays off Cade in the situations we talked about a little bit ago. And I think JI can do the same thing. He can play on the second side, let Cade create an advantage, and then good luck closing out to JI with his first step in the way he gets downhill. Stagger him out, put more floor spacing on the floor for Cade, and let JI cook in the second unit against other teams' second units is what I would really, really like to see for him this season. So I'm still very much a believer. I don't know. I'm probably as high as anybody. I think there's a lot of other fans who feel a little bit lower on JI. You know, like if you ranked Pistons prospects, he may be at the bottom of that list. There's a lot more Asar fans and JD fans, but I'm kind of sticking to JI right now. And like you said, the rim pressure is important in this league, and I think he does it at a pretty high level.
Again, can we just like modernize this offense and say Jaden and Cade hear space and be yourselves? Are there 5 players in a league quicker with the ball in their hands than Jaden Ivey?
I mean, I think me and Omari, my co-host, felt like he had an elite first step when he came into the league, right? Like everybody has their superpower or whatever you want to call it. We felt like that was JI's. He was coming into the league with just this elite first step burst. The issue for him is he doesn't have like crazy vertical pop when he gets to the rim. So he's got to add and sometimes he can't slow himself down. So, you know, watching LeBron, honestly, in the Olympics, I wrote this a couple times in my breakdowns, is watching LeBron have so much momentum going to the basket, but be able to compose himself and have the touch he does on some of those finishes is, I don't think people appreciate it enough. It's crazy. And so JI's got to figure that part out of, I'm so fast and I can play through the contact, but then I got to be able to slow myself down or compose myself or whatever and find that touch at the rim. It did get better. He got better at it. But I think that's the big thing with him, is converting on the decisions and the plays when he does break down the defense and get into the lane.
I think that's why, and this is something you probably hear it being talked about a little bit more recently, because the guys like SGA, for example. But I think that's why deceleration is such a underrated. It's like, it's got to be one of the 3 most important factors now in terms of like evaluating a player's true athleticism.
Yeah.
Because I actually think of Ja, who we don't normally think about a ton with like deceleration, but he's kind of underrated at it, I think. Where he is this lightning bolt, like quick dude, but like he can get crafty, he can kind of decelerate. Obviously, SGA, Luka in a very weird way. His is like re-accelerate.
Luka was the name that popped in my head as well. It's different, right? I think Luka's is almost more just general balance that he has. Him and Jokic are similar in that way, where they're strong compared to who they're usually driving against, but they never get knocked off balance. But there is a level of deceleration in the same sense of being able to go one way, stop your momentum, and go straight up or go to the side with a Euro or whatever. I think the biggest thing with JI is probably the touch at the end of all of what we're talking about as well. So it will be interesting. But again, I'm not selling any JI stock. I thought he took a small step defensively just by giving multiple efforts and second efforts on that end. And then he's so gifted athletically that just by he still gets hung up on screens, but he doesn't die on them anymore. He makes the second effort, and then maybe he tips the ball from behind or contests the shot or blocks it off the backboard. And that had made him a better and more impactful defender, albeit not quite neutral yet.
So, you know, last kind of individual player here, and that is a Mr. Jalen Duren, you know, one or the other. And again, just a guy that you're like, man, where it's got to happen now. We are kind of like year 3, you know, NFL, it's kind of like year 2, I feel like, for quarterbacks, for example, like Anthony Richardson, quarterback of the Colts. Okay, we got to start to see a little bit now, right?
I mean, I think it's for a lot, like, not to go with full football. I'm a Chiefs fan, and I listen to Chiefs. They drafted a guy.
Oh, come on, Bryce.
Lifelong, wasn't bandwagon. We deserve what we're getting right now with Patrick Mahomes. But they drafted a defensive end. His nickname's FAU, Felix Enudike-Uzama from K-State. And the podcast are talking about not very many first-round defensive ends have had good careers if they didn't pop in at least year 2. So, I would agree. I think in the NFL, it's probably year 2 for a lot of positions. And then the NBA, I think if you're not seeing it by year 3, I think it's at least fair to worry, right, Sean? Like, we can at least go, man, is this actually going to happen? Like, are we going to see it and really start to have at least some questions that are fair?
I mean, like, the perfect example of that, and he had a ridiculous stretch, but the perfect example of that is what Jalen Green and the Rockets, where it was kind of so bad at the start to where like, ooh, we don't even care about this month of March stretch, where he averaged, 27 on 52, 45% efficiency. It's year 3, and we talked about it with Ivy, we talked about it with Duren. I mean, we're now about to talk about what is it with Jalen Duren? Is it more or less, or I know we're concerned about the defense. I guess we'll start there. What is it you think with Jalen defensively, and that we're hoping that JB can kind of correct there?
It is the defense for me. Like, I mean, if Jalen Duren was better than neutral defensively, and right now I don't even think he's neutral, I would be all about it. I'm like, this is the pay him a certain amount of money, not a rookie max, obviously, but pay him. This is the center for your next 7-8 years. He's a great lob threat for Cade. He offensive rebounds like very few in the NBA.
Yeah,
rebounding in general, and you know, maybe the shot comes around to the mid range. He shot actually almost 80% from the free throw line this last year. Hopefully the passing stuff gets better. Sean, like, sure, he's not very good defensively. And, you know, we've talked about 3 young guys now, and we've said the same thing about all of them. And that's part of the issue here is as well. And one of the biggest things, he's not disruptive defensively. You know, Jalen Duren this is what's crazy. Jalen Duren played almost 30 minutes a game last year, didn't even average a block per game. And when you average, you know, include steals, so the stocks stat that we like to use now, 1.3. 1.3 stocks is all we got from Jalen Duren. Now, I'm not somebody that says steals and blocks are everything, but there's a certain level of disruption you want from especially your big men, and he just quite honestly hasn't provided it through 2 seasons.
The bigs are oftentimes the anchor, if not 90% of the times the anchor of the defense. And I have, and let me see if I can really quickly fact check, but it would not surprise me if I have the Pistons ranking this. So I have like defensive tiers, and for each team, the Pistons in this series, oh man, they're lucky that I actually like some of the wing defenders. I have the Pistons in tier 6. I have 7 tiers. They're tier 6, 20 to 25. But that's because in theory, you have some guys, I'm like, oh, okay, primarily Asar, and that's obviously the main guy. But imagine if Jalen Duren could be that enforcer, can be that anchor. Then we're talking about a for sure top 20 team defensively because of the rim protection and that one potentially elite wing defender. You don't need a lot nowadays to be a good NBA defense. And it starts with Jalen, and it's kind of frustrating.
I agree. You know, Asar, I think, has real potential on the defensive end on the wing. I think Ron doesn't have as high a potential as Asar, but has potential. Like those guys, those two have a chance if they can be on the floor together with spacing to be a real duo on the wing defensively. I think Cade could at least get to neutral. I think J.I. has the potential to get neutral. Like even guys like Fontecchio's neutral. Tobias can take some of the matchups that this roster used to not have the guy to do. It really comes, you know, even off the bench. Isaiah Stewart is a great big off the bench defensively. Jalen Duren is the linchpin here on the defensive end. And my thing, it's not like he's spacing the floor. So like, that's my thing with JD is he doesn't space the floor on the offensive end. He's not one of those type of bigs, but then he's not also this just crazy defensive anchor on the other end. And so, you know, he does rebound and play finish. So that's one, but I want him to do one of the other 2 things. If he spaced the floor, I could be like, okay, well, defense isn't great, but at least he's spacing the floor, but he's not doing that, you know? And so I think the defensive end is the place he has the opportunity to do those things. And I just would like to see, maybe this may be JB's biggest thing, right, Sean? Like, you know, we've talked about Fred Vincent with the floor spacing and the shooting of Asar and J.I. and Ron Hollins. Maybe the biggest thing here is JB or whoever on staff getting Jalen Duren to that space on the defensive end.
Is there anything kind of skill wise with Jalen? You're like, man, like is it, you know, IQ defensively where like, okay, man, you know, and this is probably a bad example, but I think for me, when a big pet peeve of mine when I'm watching bigs kind of play in particularly like drop is where they do a solid job of kind of showing at the ball or whatever to like stop it, allow the screen navigator to recover, whatever. But they don't kind of play both, where I think you kind of have to, right? At least until that screen navigator gets back, you have to play both. You have to have the active hand, show the ball, see the ball, and also know that there's a guy rolling behind you. I think AD is the best on Rudy, 2 best on the planet.
AD's awesome. Yeah, Bam's good as well.
Bam's also great. Is there anything skill-wise with Jalen, like, man, this is probably the biggest thing that's hindering him defensively?
You just said it. I think his hand activity. And that's one thing I really watch with bigs anymore in the NBA, because it's hard to guard in the NBA. It really is. These guys are really, really good. And so you can't just do it by being in the right position. You have to use your length and understanding. And so I just I watch JD a lot. It's like he doesn't have his hand in that pocket pass. So it gets through there,
Yeah.
or he gets his hips turned and he doesn't stay square. So then when the pass goes through, it's a hard recovery for him to get back. It's not a physically thing. Now, the one thing with JD is he's also not like a 7-footer. That's one thing I don't think people realize.
6'10", right?
Yeah, 6'10". So he's it's not like he's short, but he's also not just crazy long. And so that's one thing with him, but he has the vertical pop and explosion that he could do these things. I just think because of that, he has to be even better, making sure his hands are in the right place, they're active. And I hate using the term, but I think the energy level just has to run a little bit faster. And this was a thing going back to his scouting report coming into the NBA, was just kind of that engine running a little bit more, that motor running a little bit more on the defensive end. And so you would like to think here in year 3, some of these things would start to click for him.
It's kind of ironic, right? Because you talk about, his size, whatever, and kind of the hand activity. And maybe it's fresh in my mind because I was watching this team play against the Blazers before my Blazers episode. But when I think about two of the best bigs in terms of being active in the passing lane, specifically like not allowing those pocket passes against ice or drop coverage or whatever, or just being active with their hands around the rim, in helping with or in general, is Draymond Green, obviously. And then like Bam. Yeah. Like those are two of the best. And they are both kind of ironically, like I said, undersized for the big position, where Draymond's more of a 4, but they'll do some stretch 5 stuff with them. But Bam's 6'10", like barely. So it's different comp. Bam's ridiculous defensively, but I do think that's interesting. Like, dog, there are examples of this in the league. We be more active with your hands, like you mentioned. And the mode I do that definitely was, as I recall, something was talked about with Jalen Duren a ton back in 2022. So yeah, really hoping that can turn around this year.
Yeah, I mean, it would be. I think him and J.I. obviously, I mentioned a little bit, like they are year 3, which means this next offseason you can start talking extensions and stuff like that. And so I don't know how Trajan will play it, but I would like to think, or I feel like he's going to want to know how he feels about these guys moving forward by the time this season is over. And so I do think these guys will get a real chance. So I won't bury a question here that I think you may ask, but I don't want to go into like what I think the starting lineup is going to be or anything.
That's enough.
Yeah. So, I just think those guys are going to get a lot of opportunities to show. I think Trajan will want to see. He'll use this season as he has a little bit more time with Asar, and Asar is coming off the blood clot thing from the last season. Obviously, plenty of time with Ron Holland. I think there's Cade Cunningham's locked in. I think there's a little bit more in terms of needing to figure this out with J.I. and JD this season.
Have you been keeping up with the Hard Knock series and like the Giants specifically?
I have not.
Okay, so with the Hard Knock series with the Giants, I normally don't watch it, but I was, I think I was on a flight to LA, and I said, screw it, we'll watch it. And they really did a good job of like highlighting the free agency process for the Giants and going in depth with their draft prep. I would have loved to see kind of the Pistons like be a fly on the wall when they're saying, hey, look, Tobias, let's go. Let's just, who cares? Let's just get some more floor space in. And I want to wrap up kind of our player discussion before we get to like some superlatives before we get out of here. What was your initial reaction? Pick number 5 rolls in, and it's Ron Holland.
I was shocked. I was surprised. I did not expect that to be the selection. I wasn't a huge fan of it initially, even though I will say I like you, was a Ron Holland fan. I just didn't think he made as much sense for Detroit because of what I outlined earlier with the non-floor spacers and all of that. The one thing I will say is, if you look at who was available at 5, I don't know that who you draft that didn't have some of those questions ultimately. And at that time, we didn't know what Trajan and the front office was going to do in terms of adding the floor spacing around these young guys that they ultimately did. And so I have warmed up to the idea of, hey, let's go ahead and swing for the fence, potential 2-way wing. Jaylen Brown is the high end outcome. high-end comp. I don't want to like go crazy here, but that's the name of what, Ron Holland could eventually become, potentially. Put whatever percentage chance on that you want. Always like to give the caveat, but I understand Trajan wanting to swing for the fences, especially if maybe he doesn't see it with J.I. as much or Asar as much, and he felt like he needed to get another potential high-end player to go along with Cade Cunningham over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I love Ron. Similar reaction was like, oh, I'm not going to lie. I thought it was going to be because the board went Zach, Alex, Reed, and then who was 4? I'm trying to I'm blanking all of a sudden.
Zach, Alex, Reed, and then Steph Castle to the Spurs.
Right.
So Klingen's on the board, Modest, Cody.
Yeah.
And Dalton Connect for me, obviously.
I thought they were going Dalton.
Not the rest of the NBA, apparently.
Clearly not, right. Yeah, it was definitely a little bit of a shock. I think I talked about the possibility of them just saying, you know what, let's go get our defensive anchor and doing Klingen. We had talked about that a little bit. Yeah, I didn't see Ron. Not complaining necessarily because, like I said, I love Ron, but definitely.
Yeah, I had Ron as a top 5 prospect. I just often in mock drafts had him outside the top 5 because I thought that the team fit needed to, like, I was okay mocking him to the Hornets a lot of times because he's in between LaMelo Ball and Brandon Williams, Brandon Miller, that can really space the floor, and so like, okay, this is going to be okay, if he ends up there. So that's why it surprised me. I didn't have him on my Pistons radar. I figured they would go somebody with a little bit more floor spacing. But again, if you look at the names that are drafted Tijon Salon, not a guaranteed floor spacer. Klingen, same thing. Dillingham was that's a different kind of pick. Edey, Cody Williams, low volume. Modest, not a great floor spacer. Topic, Devin Carter was the one. He only has 1 year of it, and then you're outside the lottery at that point. So I understand it. I've warmed up to it for sure. So we'll see.
All right, so let's wrap up with some team superlatives here. Let's start things off with, I think, an easy one. Team MVP.
Cade Cunningham.
Yeah. He was going to surprise the masses and go with Killian Hayes.
Oh, no. Killian, back in the league. He's in camps. So.
Where is he at right now?
Brooklyn, I believe. He got I don't think it ever came out officially. I'm going to look it up right now, but it is Brooklyn.
Right.
Yeah. I just don't know if it ever came out, if it was like, if there were any guarantees on the contract or anything like that. So, yeah, I'll have to look on Spot Track.
All right, let's go with breakout player of the year.
I got to stick with I'm going to say Jaden Ivey. And I know some people are going to go look at J.I.'s stats and be like, oh, like, I just think he's going to be the player I thought since he was drafted. That's the guy who I think is going to hit the level, the minutes as a starter, all of those things that I thought whenever he was picked, showing that he can play with Cade Cunningham, but then showing that he can kind of run a second unit. I'm going to go with J.I.
I like that. I like that one as well. Probably another easy one. Defensive player of the year.
Asar.
Yeah.
Asar's good, man. Like,
he's awesome.
I know we haven't talked about him a lot, and there's some real I think I'm lower on his offense than a lot of people are. I think there's real concerns there in terms of not just the shooting, but even the ball handling and some of those things. But now, if you want to get creative, you can do some cool things with Asar. I would love to see more Cade Asar pick and roll stuff, but
yeah,
real difference maker on the defensive end and on the boards.
Yeah. And again, that's why I would have said, no, know what? Let's just go get Adelman, go get more offensive minded, but It is what it is. JB, though, I think it's going to completely utilize him perfectly defensively.
Yeah, sure.
No worries about that.
Yeah.
Which player has the most to prove this season?
That's a really interesting question. So I feel like a sneaky answer here is Tobias. I feel like they put a lot of money into Tobias, and there's a lot of expectations for him to go. And like, there's, he's at least the third option on the floor. And a lot of times he's going to be the second option on the floor.
Just because of the floor spacing. And the money they paid him.
The money, and there's not a bunch of like true like bucket getters on this roster necessarily, right? Like Malik spaces the floor, Fontecchio spaces the floor, but those guys aren't like necessarily. I don't think Ron's playing a huge offensive load this season. So yeah, when Cade and JR on the floor, Tobias may be option 3, but then you stagger him out and bring in Beasley. I think Tobias is option number 2 then in that lineup.
Yeah,
I'll go Jalen Duren though. I'll say Jalen Duren.
I would also go with Jalen Duren. I think Jaden has an all right floor at the very least. Like I trust Jaden's floor a little bit more to where if they are the exact same player at the end of this season, I'm like, okay, Jaden is just that 6-man or whatever, or
he probably gets traded to actually do that because again, I don't know how many top 5 picks ended up being, but I think he could at least be the third guard, the 6-man. With Jalen Duren, if he doesn't get better defensively and doesn't get a jumper, like you can probably go find a guy that's going to get. I mean, I know he rebounds a lot, but how valuable is
one
that?
Of those?
That's what I'm saying. Like you can give somebody 30 minutes that's going to give you 90% of those points and rebounds, but maybe a little bit better defensively or space the floor, or something like that. So
really quick to go back to breakout players. It's just a draft darling of mine last year. I'm going to go Marcus Sasser.
Okay.
He's so fun.
Marcus Sasser is really interesting. So my thing with Sasser is I don't think they've utilized him correctly. They've played him on the ball as like the primary, like almost point guard more than what I would like. What I liked about the Sasser pick was I liked him playing next to Cade, like staggering in and playing next to a bigger guard where he could just be off the ball and provide floor spacing a little bit more and then kind of be that bulldog on defense. And that just hasn't been the way he's been used so far in his career. So,
yeah, man. Really quickly though, I didn't know this actually. He shot 41.7% on pick and roll threes last season.
Sasser? Yeah, no, he shoots that thing off the bounce, man. He's not scared at all.
Definitely not. All right, and then let's go with this one. And whether it's via play-in or not, the Pistons make the playoffs if finish the sentence.
Cade plays at an all NBA level.
Okay.
NBA.
You're saying that.
That's how they make the playoffs. If Cade plays
for a full year.
Yeah, if Cade plays at an all NBA level, that's what would have to happen. Like, there's some other things that need to happen, but he needs to take the jump to 28-8 on 48, 39, 7
the turnovers,
7 free throw attempts. Like he has to be an all NBA level player. I think there's expectations of at the All-Star break, there's conversation of Cade being an all-star that maybe the team's somewhat good enough. But like if they were going to make the play, and he'd have to be an all NBA level player. Because like I don't even think at 32 Tobias is going to just go average 23 this year or something, or as much as I love J.I., I don't think he's going to jump to 20 points per game this year, or Duren's going to average 4 stocks all of a sudden or something, like I just don't think those things happen. So it would be Cade just going into another stratosphere in year 4.
I think with J.I., it's more or less like it just all like coming together. I feel where Jalen's were like, okay, yeah, we are asking for it for a kind of dramatic leap forwards in play. Where J.I.'s like, okay, cool, can we just put this thing together and do it more consistently? Look, the Pistons are in this big cluster of teams for me, like 27th, which was the Bulls, to 20. Where it's okay, these teams all of them are fun. I think they're all fun. Like I did the Raptors, that was a pretty fun team. And they all have scenarios where I'm like, okay, cool. Man, if this one guy, maybe not the Bulls, but for the Raptors example, okay, like is quickly this all-star caliber. Not necessarily an all-star, but he's playing at an all-star caliber level. Scotty takes a step or whatever. Okay, cool. That Raptors team is really good all of a sudden. Yeah. Right? And with the Pistons, it's okay. How much better can Cade continue to progress? Can Ivy kind of put it together and, JB, at the end of the day, JB's a pretty fine coach for a situation like this. So it's not, I wouldn't completely write it off.
I mean, I think that'd be part of it too, right? Like Cade just takes this massive leap, and then JB is able to figure out the defense, whether that's with
Maybe top 20.
Yeah, perimeter players. He like you said, he employs a SAR in a really perfect role and finds the right combination of bigs to get it done and all of that. I mean, I would say the same thing for the Raptors, right? If Scotty all of a sudden, catapults himself into all NBA level conversation, now you're talking about a potential playoff team with with the players that he has around him with IQ and RJ and some of that stuff. So I think it's a similar situation with Scotty Barnes. So
well, Bryce, my friend, thank you so much for hopping on with me. This is a ton of fun. Please tell the lovely people where they can find all your great work.
Yeah, so at Motor City Hoops on Twitter, you can follow me over there. I don't just tweet about the Pistons. It's NBA draft specifically, but also NBA stuff. Pistons polls if you want Pistons content, Game Theory podcast with Sam Vecini if you want NBA draft content. And then I'll post all my Substack, stuff on my Twitter as well, where I post my game breakdowns, game notes, scouting reports, NBA draft scouting reports. I'll probably start posting those in the next couple months because, as you know, Sean, this is a pretty exciting draft that people want to know about. So if you want to get familiar with that, me and Sam already did a Nolan Traore a film breakdown over on the Game Theory podcast. So follow me on Twitter. You'll find all my stuff, man. I had a blast. I look forward to this. Even though it was the first day of school, I knew I'd be worn out. I knew the energy would come as soon as you and I got to talking. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely, man. And hopefully the Pistons are higher than 24th or 25th come around. 24th, I was right, 24th come around next season. So yeah, like I said, long day. You forget the numbers of before you have your teams at.
Oh man, I need a winning season from this team. So like I said, this will be my 5th year. So I went 14-68, 17-65, 23-59, 20-52.
And no number one picks in that. Well, you got the K draft.
The K draft. So that's in reverse order. Those are the years that I've podcasted and wrote about and video breakdown this team. And so I could use some wins, man. It would be my guy Amari's been the same way. He was in Memphis before he came to Detroit, and it was during the rebuild phase of Memphis.
No.
Then he left.
Like post grit and grind.
Yes, and then he left when they got good, came to Detroit. They get rid of Blake and Derek and all of that, and then he's lived through these 4 years of Pistons basketball. So it would be nice to podcast about some wins. Last year they went 2-1 to start the season, and we were on cloud 9. And then
beat the Heat in the Thriller, and then Wingstop started doing promos. That's how bad the season went.
It's not easy to stay positive during a 28-game losing streak. I'll let the listeners know that. So.
Well, thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of the Power Ranking series. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hit that like button and subscribe here to the channel. Till next time, everybody. See ya. Stay safe and peace out.